Initially, the USA developed and produced M4 tanks mostly for the Allies. But in December 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, when America entered the war, they also needed tanks for themselves. After the unsuccessful meeting of the M4 with the Tiger in North Africa in February 1943, the British and the Americans began to address this problem in different ways. The British military, with minimal changes, installed on the Sherman their best anti-tank gun, the 17-pounder. And the Americans had time to make a new turret for their 76mm gun. But first they had to persuade the military command to actually do it. Before World War II, the development of tank forces were poorly funded, and there were relatively few tanks in the US Army. But after the Blitzkrieg, when the Germans successfully used tanks and quickly captured Poland and France, attitude towards tank warfare had changed and raised many questions. As a result of the debate, the tank destroyer doctrine of General Leslie J. McNair was adopted. The idea was that towed and self-propelled anti-tank guns should fight enemy tanks. For this reason, the United States for a long time did not develop heavy tanks, which delayed the rearmament of the M4. However, such tactics were not very effective. The Sherman meeting with the Tigers in North Africa, Sicily and Italy, and then with the Panthers in Western Europe, showed that it was not always possible to move anti-tank units in time. Therefore, in the autumn of 1943, the Armoured Board requested the modernisation of thousands of M4 tanks with a new weapon, capable of penetrating the Tigers and the Panthers at a comfortable distance of 1,000 metres. And this was in order to prepare for the landings in Normandy. However, the Army ground forces were once again against the idea and did not allow the modernisation project in time. The position of General McNair remained the same. He believed that the destruction of enemy tanks was an artillery and tank destroyer task, and the use of guns with high armour-piercing capabilities would provoke tank-on-tank battles, which would distract the crews from their main mission, that of supporting the infantry. Unfortunately, history showed that such a decision was a mistake. The number of Tigers and Panthers in France was greatly underestimated. The M4 constantly met with German tanks and found themselves in difficult situations. Only in the summer of 1944, after heavy losses in Normandy, did the military begin to urgently re-equip the Shermans and install a 76mm gun. But this weapon technically could have already been installed in August 1942. The gun had serious drawbacks. To compensate for the weight of the longer barrel, it was necessary to install a counterweight in the back of the turret. The designers suggested that the ammunition could be placed here. However, this option did not satisfy the armoured force. The new gun took up too much space in the small Sherman turret, and the shells were much larger than for the 75mm gun. This greatly reduced the combat effectiveness of the crew, and most of all, the rate of fire. It became clear that the Sherman needed a new turret. At this time in development was the T-20 tank, whose turret was larger and there was enough room inside for the 76mm gun. In May 1943, the prototypes of the modernised M4s with the new turret and gun were successfully tested. The US's 76mm gun had the same drawbacks as any high-velocity guns. The shot was accompanied by a very bright flash and raised a large cloud of dust, which made it very difficult to see whether the round had hit the enemy. It was also difficult to correct the shot. But this drawback became less important right after the landings in Normandy. For the crews, it was more important to have the ability to fight the Tigers and Panthers. Because of the new turret and the new gun, the tank became noticeably heavier. This worsened its manoeuvrability. The solution to this problem was the new HVSS suspension, the horizontal volute spring suspension, and the installation of wider steel tracks. On this suspension, the buffer springs were moved from the vertical to the horizontal position. Despite the fact that the new suspension and steel tracks increased the weight even more, the specific pressure on the ground actually decreased due to the width of the new track, and therefore the manoeuvrability increased. The new model with this suspension received the designation E8, more commonly referred to as the Easy 8. The main feature of the Sherman was its relative simplicity and modernisation. Tanks damaged in combat could not only be repaired but also upgraded by the use of a special kit. The first version of Shermans, released in 1942, received the nickname of Ronson, named after the famous lighter. Now, this was because of the very vulnerable storage of the ammunition, which was located in the very vulnerable sponsons just above the tracks. It meant if the tank was hit by enemy fire, there was an extreme likelihood that the ammunition would cook off. In later Sherman versions, designers moved the ammunition stowage to the hull floor. But the main thing that reduced the fire hazard was a new wet stowage, with water jackets surrounding each stowage bin. It greatly reduced the chance of fire after a hit. The older variants had improved armour, but the tank still remained a medium tank and could not be compared in terms of protection to the German heavies. To increase the protection against anti-tank weapons such as the Panzerschreck, the crews tried to strengthen the armour themselves with improvisation. This included sandbags, spare track links, concrete, wire mesh or even wood for increased protection against shape-charged rounds. By the end of the war, the later version of Sherman was very different to the original. At long last, the Sherman was becoming a serious threat to the Tigers and Panthers. The initial velocity of the armoured-piercing projectile was 780 metres per second. The shell penetrated 101 millimetres of armour at a distance of 900 metres. This made it possible to penetrate the German tanks at a much safer distance. Now, you may have noticed that this vehicle was actually a movie star and was the main star of the hit movie Fury. Now, in the movie, this vehicle played an M4A3 EZ8, but actually the vehicle shown here is an M4A2 EZ8. The Shermans went through almost the entire war and without doubt played an important part in the Allied victory. But in the last few months of the war, far more modern tanks began to appear, which far exceeded the Shermans' armament, armour and mobility. Shermans, like honourable veterans, gradually retired. They were either handed over to Allied countries or used to train recruits. Now, you may think this is the end of the Sherman story. However, in the mid-1950s, the French give them a new lease of life. More about that in the next episode.